The city sparkled under a blanket of freshly fallen snow, transforming its bustling streets into a winter wonderland. Strings of twinkling lights adorned every lamppost, their golden glow reflecting off frosted windows. The air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon from the nearby holiday market, where children laughed and carolers sang familiar tunes. Amid the festive cheer, a small crowd gathered by a towering Christmas tree in the central square, its ornaments glinting like jewels under the icy moonlight. For most, this was a season of joy and togetherness. But for one man sitting on the edge of the square, the scene was a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Ethan's clothes were tattered, his boots worn down to paper-thin soles that barely shielded him from the cold. His once proud shoulders now hunched against the wind, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who had lived more years on the street than in a warm home. Once a construction worker with a steady job and a family, Ethan had seen his life spiral out of control after a workplace accident left him unable to work. Medical bills piled up, his marriage crumbled under the strain, and before he knew it, he was alone. Tonight, the world around him seemed more distant than ever. Children dashed past with mittened hands clutching candy canes, their laughter cutting through the icy air. Couples strolled hand in hand, their faces aglow with happiness. Ethan pulled his threadbare coat tighter around himself and looked at the Santa figure sitting near the tree, a volunteer collecting donations for charity. Something about the man's warm smile and the cheerful way he waved to passers-by caught Ethan's attention. He wasn't like the other Santas he'd seen, his costume wasn't overly polished, and his beard looked real. Maybe it was the twinkle in his eyes or the way he spoke kindly to everyone, but Ethan felt an unexpected pull. "Go on," whispered an older woman who had just dropped some coins into the donation box. She had noticed Ethan's hesitation. Sometimes a little hope is all you need. Ethan hesitated, then slowly rose to his feet. The weight of his pride felt heavier than ever, but desperation pushed him forward. "Evening, young man," Santa greeted warmly, his voice deep and comforting. "What can I do for you?" Ethan swallowed hard. I don't need money," he began, his voice cracking. I don't know how to get back on my feet. I'm tired of living like this. I don't even know if I believe in miracles anymore, but, if there's anything you can do," he trailed off, embarrassed by his vulnerability. Santa's eyes softened, and for a moment, he seemed to search Ethan's face as if looking for something deeper. "Sometimes, what we need most isn't what we ask for," he said mysteriously. He reached into the red sack by his side and pulled out a small wrapped package. Ethan frowned. "What's this?" "Call it a token of hope," Santa replied. "Open it when you're ready." Ethan accepted the gift, murmured a quiet thank you, and walked away, unsure if he felt foolish or grateful. That night, Ethan found shelter under an overpass, the package tucked tightly under his arm. Snow fell steadily, and the cold bit into his skin. He debated opening the gift but worried it would only deepen his disappointment. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. Peeling back the paper, he revealed a simple envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Believe in the goodness of others and yourself. Help is closer than you think." Beneath the note was a folded piece of paper, a voucher for a hot meal at the diner down the street. Attached was a business card for a local shelter. Ethan stared at the items, his hands trembling. It wasn't the grand miracle he'd secretly wished for, but it was something. It was a start. The next morning, he walked into the diner, unsure of what to expect. The waitress greeted him with a warm smile, and the aroma of coffee and bacon filled the air. "You must be Ethan," she said, surprising him. "Santa told us you'd be coming. Breakfast is on us." Ethan blinked. "Santa?" The waitress just nodded toward the kitchen, where the same Santa from the square stood without his costume, cooking pancakes. As Ethan ate his first hot meal in weeks, he learned that the man, whose real name was George, had once been in a similar situation. Now, He ran a program to help people like Ethan get back on their feet. George offered Ethan a place in the shelter and assistance finding work. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir in his chest, hope. On Christmas morning, Ethan woke up in a warm bed at the shelter. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. The other residents greeted him with smiles, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. The miracle Ethan had received wasn't just a meal or a roof over his head. It was the kindness of a stranger who had seen his worth when he couldn't see it himself. This Christmas, Ethan learned that miracles often come in small, unexpected packages, and that sometimes, asking for help is the bravest step toward a better future. Snow continued to fall steadily as the city bustled with holiday preparations. Ethan clutched the small package Santa had given him, unsure what to do next. He stood outside the diner, staring at the glowing, open 24/7 sign through the frosted window. People inside laughed and exchanged cheerful greetings. The warm light spilling onto the sidewalk felt like a boundary he couldn't cross. "You coming in or not, buddy?" a man asked as he brushed past Ethan and swung open the door, letting out a wave of warmth and the scent of coffee. Ethan's stomach growled, and the faint hope sparked by Santa's gift began to waver. Was he ready to face people again? He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The waitress behind the counter smiled warmly, but before Ethan could say a word, the door behind him jingled again. A young woman, her face pinched with worry, entered carrying a crying toddler wrapped in a threadbare blanket. She approached the counter and asked in a hushed voice if they had a restroom. The waitress pointed her in the right direction. As the woman disappeared, Ethan noticed the toddler's shoes were far too small, the toes visibly worn. He felt a pang of recognition, her struggle mirrored his own. When the woman returned, she hesitated near the counter, clutching her child. Her cheeks were flushed, not from the cold but from shame, as she asked the waitress, "Do you have any leftovers? Anything you were going to throw out?" The request made the room go still for a moment. A few patrons glanced up from their meals. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve leftovers," the waitress said gently, her face filled with sympathy. "But let me see what I can do." She disappeared into the kitchen. The woman stood awkwardly, avoiding everyone's gaze. Ethan could feel her discomfort. He had been in her shoes too many times to count, and he knew the courage it had taken her to ask. The waitress returned with a small box of food. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." Tears welled up in the young woman's eyes as she accepted the box. She tried to offer thanks, but her voice broke. As she turned to leave, Ethan's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where he kept the voucher Santa had given him. He hesitated, looking at the card and then at the woman's retreating figure. The meal was supposed to be his first real food in weeks. But as he thought about the child's too small shoes and the mother's desperation, he felt a pang of guilt. "Wait!" he called out, his voice echoing across the quiet diner. The woman turned, startled. Ethan walked up to her and handed her the voucher. "Here. Take this. It'll cover a proper meal for you and your kid." She looked at him, confusion and gratitude mingling in her tear-filled eyes. "I can't." "Please," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "I've been where you are. Someone helped me today. Let me do the same for you." The woman accepted the voucher with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As she sat down at a booth with her child, Ethan felt a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a faint sense of loss. The hunger gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Watching the little boy smile as he nibbled on warm pancakes filled him with a strange sense of fulfillment. The waitress approached Ethan, her expression curious. "That was a kind thing you did," she said, her tone soft. Ethan shrugged, trying to brush it off. "She needed it more than I did." The waitress studied him for a moment, then gave him a small smile. "Wait here," she said and walked back into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a steaming plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. "On the house," she said, setting it down in front of him. Ethan stared at the plate, overwhelmed by her generosity. "Why?" he asked. "Because kindness has a way of coming back around," she said simply. As Ethan dug into his first hot meal in weeks, he realized something profound. By giving away his own small miracle, he had found a greater one, the understanding that the spirit of Christmas wasn't about receiving but about giving, even when you have little to spare. This quiet act of selflessness not only changed Ethan's night but also began to heal the ache in his heart that had festered for years. The diner buzzed softly as Ethan savored the unexpected meal, but the warmth of the food couldn't entirely erase the gnawing doubt in his mind. Had giving away the voucher been the right decision? The memory of the woman's grateful smile gave him comfort, yet his hunger remained a stark reminder of his own needs. Outside, the snowstorm grew heavier, wrapping the city in a thick, white silence. Ethan stared through the window at the glowing Christmas lights across the square, their cheerful blinking seeming to mock his uncertain future. He could still see the towering Christmas tree where the Santa had sat earlier, now nearly obscured by falling snow. "Need anything else?" the waitress asked, breaking his thoughts. Ethan shook his head. This was more than enough. "Thank you." But as he prepared to leave, a wave of unease settled over him. The snow was falling harder now, and the streets had emptied except for the occasional bundled-up pedestrian hurrying to find warmth. Ethan had nowhere to go, and the thought of returning to the overpass in this weather filled him with dread. He hesitated by the counter, unsure of his next move, when the young mother approached him. Her son was now fast asleep in her arms, his face peaceful and content. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done tonight without your help." Ethan offered a faint smile. "It's nothing. Just paying it forward." Her gaze lingered on him, as if she could see through the brave front he was putting up. "Do you have somewhere warm to stay tonight?" she asked hesitantly. Ethan opened his mouth to lie but stopped. What was the point? "Not really," he admitted, his voice barely audible. She looked down at her sleeping child, torn between gratitude and guilt. "I wish I could help," she whispered, her voice breaking. Before Ethan could respond, the door jingled open again, and the cold wind rushed in. A man in a heavy coat and scarf entered, stomping snow off his boots. He was middle-aged, with a sharp, businesslike demeanor that clashed with the diner's cozy atmosphere. "There you are," the man said, addressing the waitress. "How much longer are you staying open in this weather? The roads are getting bad." "We're closing early, Dawn," the waitress replied, gesturing to the clock. "Just finishing up with these customers." The man's eyes scanned the room, pausing on Ethan and the young mother. His expression shifted to one of suspicion. "Are they paying customers?" he asked bluntly. The waitress bristled. "They've been taken care of," she said firmly. Ethan felt his stomach knot. He wasn't used to being defended, and the man's sharp tone reminded him of countless other encounters where he'd been made to feel small. "Well, make sure they don't overstay their welcome," Dawn muttered, turning back toward the door. The festive warmth of the diner suddenly felt fragile, like a bubble ready to burst. Ethan's face burned with humiliation, but he kept his head down. He had no intention of staying where he wasn't wanted. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. The waitress frowned. "In this weather? That's not a good idea." Ethan shrugged. "I'll manage." The young mother stepped forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "Please don't go out there. It's too cold." But Ethan's pride stung, and he was already heading toward the door. He mumbled a thank you to the waitress and stepped outside into the swirling snow. The wind bit at his face as he trudged through the deserted streets. His thin coat did little to shield him from the cold, and each step became harder as the snow piled up around his ankles. The city's festive decorations, brightly lit reindeer, wreaths on lampposts, and glowing "Merry Christmas" signs, seemed mocking now, their cheerfulness a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt. He reached the overpass where he'd spent the previous night, but the space offered little protection from the storm. Snow had already drifted under the concrete, and the icy wind howled through the openings. Ethan sat down on the frozen ground, pulling his coat tighter, but his body trembled uncontrollably. As the hours passed, the storm worsened. Ethan's thoughts grew muddled, the cold numbing not just his body but his resolve. For the first time in years, he let himself cry. He cried for the life he'd lost, for the family that had drifted away, and for the bitter irony of the season, a time meant for joy and miracles that always seemed to pass him by. But amid his despair, a memory surfaced, Santa's words from earlier that evening. Help is closer than you think. At first, Ethan dismissed it as a hollow platitude, but as his tears subsided, the words took on new meaning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the card Santa had included with the voucher. The address for the shelter was scrawled in simple handwriting. Could he make it there in this storm? The thought was daunting, but staying put wasn't an option. Summoning what little strength he had left, Ethan rose to his feet and began walking, leaning against the wind. The festive decorations along the streets grew blurrier as the snow intensified. Ethan could barely see a few feet ahead, his breath coming in labored puffs. Doubts crept in with every step. What if the shelter was closed? What if he couldn't find it? But just as he felt his knees buckling, a flicker of light caught his eye. A small, glowing sign shone through the blizzard, Hope Haven Shelter, open 24/7. Tears filled his eyes as he stumbled toward the door, the warm glow beckoning him like a lifeline. The festive wreath on the door seemed almost miraculous in its simplicity, a promise of safety and warmth. Ethan reached the door and knocked weakly, his frozen hands barely able to make a sound. Moments later, it opened, and he was greeted by a woman in a festive sweater, her face kind and welcoming. "Come in," she said gently, helping him inside. As warmth enveloped him, Ethan realized that the Christmas miracle he'd sought wasn't just about survival, it was about finding hope in the kindness of others and rediscovering his own strength. Ethan sat in the shelter's common room, his body still trembling from the cold but his heart slowly thawing in the warmth that surrounded him. The room was modest but welcoming, with garlands strung along the walls and a small Christmas tree twinkling in the corner. A few other people sat at scattered tables, sipping hot cocoa or chatting quietly. The air smelled of pine and freshly baked cookies, a reminder of holidays Ethan hadn't celebrated in years. The woman who had welcomed him earlier brought him a steaming cup of tea and a blanket. "Take your time warming up," she said with a smile. "You're safe here." Ethan nodded his thanks, though he still felt uneasy. The kindness shown to him tonight felt fragile, like something that could be snatched away at any moment. He pulled the blanket tighter and glanced around, his eyes landing on a bulletin board covered in photos and notes of encouragement. A sign above it read, "Hope lives here." "Ethan, is it?" a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He wore a red sweater with a snowflake pattern and carried a clipboard. "That's me," Ethan said cautiously. The man extended a hand. "I'm Paul, the coordinator here. I wanted to introduce myself and let you know a bit about our program." Paul's voice was calm and reassuring, but Ethan couldn't help feeling skeptical. He'd encountered well-meaning people before who eventually disappeared or couldn't follow through. "You've had a rough time," Paul said, sitting across from him. "But I believe everyone deserves a second chance, especially at Christmas. We can provide you with a place to stay, meals, and help finding work. All we ask is that you trust us and give yourself a chance to rebuild." Ethan nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. The idea of rebuilding felt overwhelming, almost impossible. Paul seemed to sense his hesitation. "Let me tell you a story," he said, leaning back in his chair. Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "About 10 years ago, I was where you are now," Paul began. "Lost my job, my home, and just about all my hope. I ended up sleeping in an abandoned car during one of the coldest winters on record. Then one night, someone offered me help, a warm meal and a place to stay, just like we're offering you now. It wasn't easy to accept, but it changed my life. That person didn't just save me, they inspired me to do the same for others. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd expected pity or lectures, but Paul's story resonated deeply. What made you trust them? Ethan asked. Paul smiled. I didn't trust them right away. I had to take it one step at a time. But every small kindness helped me believe in people again, and in myself. Ethan looked down at his tea, Paul's words settling heavily in his chest. Could he find that same trust? Later that evening, as Ethan lay on a cot in the shelter, he couldn't sleep. Paul's story replayed in his mind, stirring something he hadn't felt in years, hope. He thought of the young mother and her son at the diner and how she had thanked him with tears in her eyes. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. Can't sleep either. Ethan turned to see Paul standing by the door. He held a small box wrapped in red paper. We have a tradition here, Paul said, sitting on the edge of Ethan's cot. Every Christmas, we give each new guest a gift, a little something to remind them they're not forgotten. Ethan stared at the box, overwhelmed by the gesture. You didn't have to. Just open it, Paul interrupted with a grin. With trembling hands, Ethan unwrapped the box to reveal a simple journal and a pen. The journal's cover bore the words, New Beginnings. It's for writing down your thoughts, goals, or anything you want, Paul explained. Sometimes putting your dreams on paper makes them feel real. Ethan ran his fingers over the smooth cover, his chest tightening with emotion. No one had given him a gift in years, let alone something so thoughtful. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice thick. Paul patted his shoulder. Merry Christmas, Ethan. You're not alone anymore. The next morning, Christmas Day, Ethan woke to the sound of laughter and the aroma of pancakes wafting through the air. The shelter was alive with energy as volunteers handed out gifts and children played near the tree. Ethan found himself smiling despite his lingering doubts. He joined the others for breakfast, and for the first time in years, he felt like part of a community. As he ate, Paul approached him with a stack of papers. There's a construction site nearby that's hiring. I thought you might be interested. Ethan's heart raced. He hadn't worked in years, but the idea of earning his own way again filled him with cautious excitement. You really think they'd take me? Paul nodded. We'll help you get ready, new clothes, practice for the interview. One step at a time. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. The kindness he'd received had not only given him hope but also a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that the Christmas spirit wasn't just about miracles, it was about people coming together to lift each other up. That night, as Ethan wrote in his journal under the glow of the shelter's Christmas tree, he made a promise to himself: one day, he would pay this kindness forward, just as others had done for him. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in the shelter's small bathroom, adjusting the collar of the second-hand jacket Paul had helped him find. The fabric was worn, but the warmth it provided was a far cry from the tattered coat he'd worn through the streets. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel invisible. He looked at his reflection, seeing not just the weary man who had been lost in the chaos of his own life, but someone who was slowly becoming more than his circumstances. In the weeks since Christmas, his world had shifted in ways he hadn't imagined. The construction job he'd landed was tough, but it provided more than just a paycheck, it gave him a sense of dignity and purpose he'd thought was long gone. Each day, he found himself growing stronger, not just physically but emotionally. The small steps he took, being able to pay for his own meal, putting in a full day of work, having a roof over his head, added up to something greater than survival. They were the foundation for something new, something hopeful. He thought back to that night in the diner, when he had shared his last ounce of generosity with the young mother. That simple act of kindness had planted a seed in him, one that had slowly blossomed as the days passed. What he had done that night wasn't just about giving away a meal or a voucher. It had been about choosing to trust, to break free from the walls he'd built around himself out of fear. It wasn't easy. The doubt still lingered sometimes, the familiar pull of self-pity, the voice that told him he wasn't good enough, that he didn't deserve happiness. But those moments grew fewer, overshadowed by the warmth of the shelter, the support from people like Paul, and the small victories that proved he was capable of more than he'd given himself credit for. At work, his foreman, a no-nonsense man named Jack, had started taking him under his wing. "You've got good instincts," Jack had said one day as they worked side by side on a project. "You just need to trust them more." Ethan had nodded, absorbing the compliment, but it had struck him deeper than Jack likely realized. He had never trusted himself, never believed he could be more than the man he'd seen reflected in the cracks of sidewalks or the cold stares of strangers. But now, standing here, he realized he was starting to. And it wasn't just about the job or the stability, it was about how he felt when he helped others. The shelter, Paul's kindness, the community that had embraced him, it had all inspired a shift inside him. Christmas had given him a new perspective on life. The days of fighting the cold and hunger alone had been dark, but they had also shown him the resilience he had within. Now, it wasn't about just surviving, it was about living. He closed his eyes, letting the memory of Christmas Day wash over him, the laughter in the shelter, the volunteers' cheer, the gifts they'd all received. It had felt like a dream. The gifts, the kindness, it was the kind of Christmas he had only heard about in stories. And for the first time in years, he had truly believed in miracles. But more than that, he discovered that miracles weren't just about dramatic, life-altering moments, they were in the small things, a kind word from a stranger, a meal shared, a helping hand when you least expect it. These were the true gifts of the season, the ones that stayed long after the decorations had come down. Ethan opened his eyes and smiled at his reflection. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would still have its struggles, but he was no longer the man he had been when he first walked into that diner. He had learned to accept help, to open his heart to kindness, and, most importantly, to believe in his own worth. As he headed out for his shift, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Paul, "Keep going. You're doing great. Merry Christmas, Ethan." Ethan smiled at the words. He may not have had everything he wanted, but he had something much more valuable, hope, community, and the chance to rebuild his life, one small act of kindness at a time. Ethan's transformation didn't go unnoticed. As the weeks passed, the ripple effect of his journey spread through the shelter and beyond, touching the lives of everyone around him. The simple acts of kindness he had received, the steady encouragement from people like Paul, and the warmth of a community willing to help him rebuild, these things didn't just change him. They began to change the people who witnessed his evolution. At the shelter, Ethan's progress became an inspiration. The other residents, some of whom had been in the shelter for months, saw the way he carried himself now, not just as a man trying to survive, but as someone who was determined to thrive. His quiet determination served as a beacon of hope for others who, like him, had once felt invisible. They began to believe, not only in the shelter's promises, but in their own ability to change. One morning, a man named Tim, who had been at the shelter longer than anyone else, approached Ethan as he was heading out for work. Tim was a large, burly figure with a scruffy beard, the kind of man who looked as if the world had given up on him long ago. He had always kept to himself, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. But today, there was something different in his gaze. "Hey, Ethan," Tim said gruffly, clearing his throat. "I've been thinking. If you can get your life back together, maybe I can, too." Ethan looked up, surprised. "I don't know about that, Tim. I'm just taking it one day at a time." Tim nodded, his face softening. "That's all we can do, isn't it? One day at a time. But seeing you, it gives me hope. You didn't give up when it got tough. Maybe I shouldn't either." Ethan smiled, a lump forming in his throat. "You can do it, Tim. You just have to take the first step." Tim didn't respond immediately, but Ethan could see something had shifted in him. Later that week, Tim came to Ethan with a job application he had filled out for a local warehouse. "I figured I'd give it a shot," he said, his voice still gruff but more hopeful than before. Ethan clapped him on the back, proud of the progress Tim was making, no matter how small. It wasn't just the residents at the shelter who were affected by Ethan's journey. Over at the diner, where he had first given away the voucher, the waitress, Maria, noticed a change in him as well. One evening, after he had finished a shift at the construction site, Ethan came by to grab a meal. Maria smiled when she saw him enter, but it wasn't just a casual greeting. There was something deeper in her eyes, a recognition of his hard work and the change she had witnessed in him. "You're looking better, Ethan," she said as she served him a plate of food. "More alive than I've seen you in a while." He chuckled, the warmth of her compliment filling him with pride. "Thanks, Maria. Things are different now." Maria's smile widened. "I remember that night, when you gave away that voucher to that woman and her son. You didn't have to do that, but you did. And it's funny, since then, it feels like you've been finding your way back." Ethan's heart swelled. The kindness he had extended to the mother and child that evening had come full circle. It had created a shift not only in him but in others, too. Maria's words reminded him of how much impact even the smallest gesture could have. She, too, had been inspired by his actions. The diner became a place of quiet support for Ethan. More than just a stop for a meal, it became a reminder that he was seen, not just as a homeless man, but as a person capable of making a difference. Even outside the shelter and the diner, Ethan's story spread. A local news outlet ran a brief feature about the shelter's Christmas efforts, highlighting the transformative power of kindness. The story of a man who had once been homeless, now rebuilding his life, became a symbol of hope for the community. It inspired donations to the shelter, increased volunteer efforts, and sparked conversations about the importance of helping those in need, not just at Christmas, but year-round. Ethan himself didn't seek recognition. He didn't need to be celebrated. What mattered was the realization that kindness, whether given or received, had a ripple effect that reached far beyond the person directly involved. The more people who saw him finding his way back, the more they believed that they, too, could change their circumstances. The holiday spirit, which had once seemed like a fleeting moment, had turned into a year-round commitment to compassion. In the months that followed, the shelter continued to grow, and more people, like Tim, found their way back to a new life. Paul, the shelter coordinator, had even begun training other volunteers to continue the work of showing kindness to those who walked through the doors. "It's not just about giving people food or shelter," Paul often said. "It's about giving them a chance to believe in themselves again." Ethan knew that his journey was far from over, but he was no longer walking it alone. The kindness he had once doubted now felt like the lifeblood of his new reality. And he understood, as he stood in front of the mirror once more, that kindness, whether from strangers, friends, or even from himself, was the greatest gift of all. It was the day before New Year's, and the winter chill had settled over the city like a weight, the streets blanketed in fresh snow. The construction site where Ethan worked was quiet, most of the crew having already gone home for the holidays. But Ethan stayed behind, his hands rough from work, his mind swirling with thoughts of the future. He hadn't heard from Tim in a few days, and a nagging feeling had settled in his gut. Tim had been coming by the shelter each morning to check in, but lately, he seemed to be avoiding Ethan. Worried, Ethan decided to visit him that afternoon. He knew something wasn't right. Walking through the icy streets toward Tim's usual spot at the shelter, Ethan's thoughts raced. Had Tim given up? Had the pressure of change been too much for him? As Ethan approached the shelter's door, he saw Paul outside, his face tight with concern. "Ethan, I'm glad you're here," Paul said, his voice low. "I was just about to go look for Tim." "What happened?" Ethan asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Paul ran a hand through his hair. "Tim hasn't been showing up." I think he's in trouble. Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know why, but he felt a strong pull to find Tim. Maybe it was the bond they'd formed, or maybe it was the responsibility that had grown within him. He had been given a chance, and now it was his turn to help someone else. I'll find him, Ethan said firmly. Where do I start? Paul pointed to the alley around the corner, where Tim had been spending his nights. I'll stay here in case he shows up, he said. Ethan nodded and headed out, his boots crunching in the snow. The alley was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp. As he walked further, he saw a familiar figure huddled in the shadows, a coat pulled tight around his shoulders. Tim! Ethan called out, his voice full of urgency. Tim looked up, startled, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were dull, devoid of the spark that had been there when he'd first decided to change his life. I can't do it, Ethan, Tim said, his voice shaky. I tried, but it's too much. I don't deserve to be here. I don't deserve this second chance. Ethan's heart ached. He stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Tim, you do deserve it. We all deserve a shot at something better. You've come so far, don't give up now. Tim's hands trembled as he wiped at his eyes. I'm just tired. I've failed too many times to believe I can make it. Ethan knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone in this. I've been where you are. I've been broken, lost, feeling like I didn't deserve anything. But I'm still here, and I'm fighting for it. You can too. We can do this together. For a moment, Tim didn't respond. The weight of his doubt seemed to hang in the air. But then, as if something inside him cracked open, he looked up at Ethan, his eyes brimming with tears. I don't want to go back to where I was. I'm scared, Ethan. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Ethan squeezed his shoulder, his voice steady. You don't have to do it alone. Christmas isn't just a day, it's a promise that there's always hope, even when things look impossible. We're family now. You're not giving up, Tim. You're just starting again. There, in the dim light of that snowy alley, something shifted. Tim let out a shaky breath and nodded, his shoulders slowly relaxing. Okay. Okay, I'll try. Ethan stood up, extending a hand to his friend. Tim took it, his grip still uncertain but stronger than before. Together, they walked back toward the shelter, side by side. As they approached the door, the warmth inside greeted them like an embrace. The familiar faces of the shelter's residents smiled at them, and for the first time, Ethan realized that he wasn't just part of a community, he was part of a family. That night, as the shelter gathered around the Christmas tree to celebrate, Ethan and Tim exchanged glances. Both men had been given a second chance, and now, they were determined to make the most of it. The Christmas miracle wasn't just in the gifts or the festivities, it was in the shared promise of hope, forgiveness, and the unwavering power of community. Ethan finally understood, the true miracle of Christmas wasn't about presents or decorations. It was about people, about the love we give and receive, and the strength we find in each other. As the new year unfolded, the warmth of the shelter continued to shine brightly, a beacon of hope in the midst of winter's chill. Ethan and Tim, side by side, found themselves not only surviving but thriving. The days were still hard, the challenges far from over, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Together, they could face whatever came next. Tim had slowly started rebuilding his life, taking small steps each day. He'd found a part-time job at a local grocery store, and though it wasn't much, it was enough to fill him with pride. His smile had returned, and with it, the spark of hope that had seemed lost. He and Ethan would often meet at the shelter after their shifts, exchanging stories of their days, their progress, and their struggles. Ethan, too, continued to grow. His work at the construction site had gained him more responsibility, and for the first time in a long while, he could see a future where he wasn't just scraping by. The promise of stability was a gift he didn't take for granted. But even more than that, he had learned to value the intangible, his own worth, the power of kindness, and the strength of community. One chilly evening in January, as the two men walked through the snow-covered streets after a long day, Ethan paused and turned to Tim. "You know, we're lucky," he said, a quiet smile on his face. "Not everyone gets a second chance." Tim nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "Yeah. I guess the miracle isn't in the day itself, it's in what we make of it." Ethan looked up at the clear night sky, stars twinkling above. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He didn't feel invisible. The Christmas miracle, he realized, wasn't something that happened once a year, it was something that could be found every day, in the choices we made, in the kindness we gave, and in the love we shared. As the two men made their way home, the street seemed a little brighter, the world a little kinder. Christmas had passed, but the magic lingered, woven into the fabric of their lives. In the warmth of friendship, in the embrace of community, and in the small, everyday miracles, Ethan had found something greater than survival. He had found hope. And that, he knew, was the greatest gift of all.